This is really interesting. And if you think back to when Alexander Fleming first discovered penicillin, he had an agar plate, a petri dish with bacteria on it. The fungus grew on the agar plate, and around the fungus, Alexander Fleming could see that the bacteria had been killed. And hence, we discovered penicillin, and it did great things for human health. But stop and think, why was that fungus producing antibiotic? There must be an advantage for the fungus. So that fungus was producing an antibiotic. So if it was in the same environment and the same niche as the bacteria, it would kill the bacteria, release nutrients. It would not be competing for those nutrients. So what we discovered is this is what happens in nature. So this particular type of antibiotic was being released by a fungus that grew on the skin of hedgehogs. What else grows on the skins of hedgehogs? Staphylococcus aureus, a very common bacteria found on many mammals' skins. And we wondered why, when we were looking for antibiotic-resistant bacteria, why we found so many on the hedgehog. So there were loads and loads of hedgehogs with this resistant bacteria. Why did the bacteria develop the resistance? Because if they were coexisting with the fungus on the skin of the hedgehogs, you needed to have a battle, you needed to have a weapon against the antibiotic if you were going to survive. So the fungus was producing the antibiotic, and the bacteria responded in the only way they knew how, which was to develop resistance. The obvious thing about many bacteria is that they either live in the environment or they live on hosts, but they live on multiple hosts. So it's no great surprise that bacteria who have sort of evolved to grow on the skin of mammals could end up growing on the skin of many different species of mammals. So what's happening here is that when human beings encounter hedgehogs, or whether they encounter cows or cats and dogs, occasionally they pick up their bacteria. So the only question you probably want to ask is how do human beings and hedgehogs sort of contact each other? Well, in the UK, hedgehogs are very much loved sort of wild animals, and people will sometimes, if they find them in their gardens, they might handle them, might pick them up. And certainly the pets they have might nuzzle around the hedgehogs, pick up the bacteria, and then transfer it to their owners. So one of the interesting things about this was when we first discovered this type of antibiotic resistance, we discovered it in dairy cows. And having found it in dairy cows, we wondered, where they got it from, or how we sort of assumed at that stage is that this bacteria probably did exist in nature before we started to use antibiotics. And using lots of antibiotics on dairy farms had selected for these resistant bacteria, got into humans either through the food chain or just through farmers or people working or living on farms, picking it up from the cows. And so this sort of spread it. But one of the things we did find, we found it in human beings in the UK. And interestingly, in England, we found loads of this MRSA in cows. But in Denmark, we didn't find it in cows at all. And it did start to raise our suspicion as to where people in Denmark were actually getting it from, if they weren't getting it from dairy cows. And there was a PhD student, Sophie Rasmussen, in Denmark, who's very interested in the hedgehogs, who first brought this to our attention because she gave these some dead hedgehogs to colleagues in Denmark, and they were the first people to begin to notice there was an unusually large number of bacteria of MRSA on these hedgehogs. So in Denmark, we think that it is directly from hedgehogs to people, and some of our research that's described in the paper involved DNA sequencing and comparing the DNA sequences of the bacteria on the hedgehogs to those on people. It is quite obvious that in each geographical area we looked at, the hedgehog isolates were very closely related to the human isolates, which does indicate direct hedgehog to human spread. Scientists should be skeptical. And one of our first thoughts was, well, it's unsurprising that we've ended up with high levels of antibiotic resistance in these bacteria, because a lot of antibiotics are used by people for human treatment, they're used on farms for animal treatment, and the hedgehogs may have picked them up from people. Doesn't quite explain why there might be so many on hedgehogs, but it does, you do think, well, was the natural selection that first occurred, did it come from as a result of human use? So we wanted to look for evidence that it either was due to human use or not due to human use. And one way to do that is with our DNA sequencing of the genomes of bacteria, is to reconstruct the family tree. It's a sort of what we would call a phylogeny. And what we're looking for is to identify in the family tree, down at the root, when did the hedgehog branch separate away from the main branch of the family tree. In other words, the branch that gave rise to human MRSA. And we were able to show that the most recent common ancestor, in other words, the split at the base of the tree, occurred over 200 years ago. And clearly that predates human beings began to use a lot of antibiotics. So it's good evidence. It's not perfect evidence, but it's good evidence that what we're seeing is a phenomenon that happened a long time before people used antibiotics. If you want to understand what's going on in the world, you need to understand much of the world. But I mean, more recently, it has become very obvious that if you just study disease or antibiotic resistance in human beings, you will not get the whole picture. Almost every pandemic, epidemic of importance in the last 100 years has come from animals. So whether it's HIV from chimpanzees, or it's swine flu or bird flu, all these things come from animals. So if you want to see where the next challenge or when the next problem is going to come, you've got to look more widely than just in human or laboratory medicine. So the whole of this MRSA story, from the first discovery of this MRSA MRSA that we found in dairy cows and then found in people, to looking to see the origins of this type of MRSA, came from not being blinkered by only looking in veterinary medicine or only looking in human medicine. We are trying to gather information from whatever source, and we have shown that in this particular instance that wildlife, in particular hedgehogs, represent a large reservoir of antibiotic resistance that is potentially of great importance to human health. Now, at the moment, this type of MRSA doesn't cause a lot of problems in people. It's relatively rare. It's more common in dairy cows. It's very common in hedgehogs. But if we don't stick to good antibiotic stewardship principles, if we misuse antibiotics, there are plenty of bacteria that are ready to take advantage of a situation where overuse of antibiotics has wiped out the indigenous commensal populations, say on the skins of people or farm animals. These bacteria are ready and waiting to colonize them if we misuse antibiotics. So it's a good reminder that we need to husband this precious resource that we have benefited from for so long.